Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm really happy to introduce Bill Robbins, who is well known to many of us here at OSU. It's a little known fact that Bill and I went to the same high school back in Torrington, Connecticut, which is something we discovered when we had lunch together here after I moved here. So Bill had the sense to leave Connecticut long before I did, but so he earned his BS actually from Western Connecticut State University and his MA and PhD from the University of Oregon. And he is a distinguished professor emeritus of history here at OSU, author of a large number of books on the history of the American West, and particularly on the environmental history of Oregon. Most recently, he co-authored Nature's Northwest, the North Pacific Slope in the 20th Century. And there are some of his books in the back for sale and signature afterwards, if you're interested. And that includes Hard Times in Paradise, Coos by Oregon, Landscapes of Conflict, The Oregon Story, 1940 to 2000, and Landscapes of Promise, The Oregon Story, 1800 to 1940. He's been very active professionally, a great citizen all around of the history department and of his profession of history, and I'm just really delighted to welcome Bill here to talk about his latest project, his book, which he's just finished on Monroe Sweetland, who is a really interesting guy who I knew nothing about until I started talking to Bill about this. So you're in for a real treat, and please welcome Bill Robbins.
Thank you, Anita. I'm intimidated seeing longtime friends and not having spoken to a group of historians for ages. And this is my first venture before a group such as this in many years. I want to say a word about Torrington, Connecticut that Anita missed, and that is that the Torrington High School are the Red Raiders, and their fight song is the Notre Dame fight song. So that shows real ingenuity and initiative. I want to say a word of thanks to the Oregon State University archives staff who have been with me on one book project and now a second one. The first one being the Monroe Sweetland project, when Larry Landis, the archivist, 5 years ago, made an arrangement with the Oregon Historical Society's library to have some close to 100 boxes of the Monroe Sweetland papers shipped to our archives here so that I didn't have to drive back and forth to Portland to do research. And as I told someone at the time, I grew 10 years younger, literally, with that moment. And now I'm on a second project, which a few of you know about, and that is doing a history of Oregon State University as a land-grant institution. And I'm going to share a little bit of that in this afternoon's paper because it's pertinent to my discussion. American Liberalism in the Cold War, Monroe Sweetland, and the Liberal Paradox will sound to you horribly critical, and you're wondering what kind of a biography is this? Well, I've ferreted through the manuscript, and I've chosen those elements to piece together a thematic talk on Monroe Sweetland and the Cold War, and especially American liberalism in the Cold War. And it is an indictment of sorts. However, one should not say that that kind of criticism pertains to the biography, because Monroe Sweetland was a remarkable person in many respects. First, let me give you a brief sketch of his early life. He was born in Salem, Oregon, and then moved with his family when he was 6 years old to Constantine, Michigan. The reason for that move had to do with the death of his uncle, his father's brother. His father was a physician like his brother, and his father moved the family to Constantine, which is a little farming community, about 1,200 people, and still about 1,200 people. to take over his brother's practice, that in 1916. Monroe was born in 1910. In an interview in 1985, Monroe remembered Constantine, and I'm quoting, as insular, rural Protestant, Republican, with one Catholic and one Jewish family, and 2 or 3 African American families. Yet young Sweetland described Constantine as a good place to live. He ran trap lines in the winter, hunted and fished in season, worked regularly caring for neighbors' lawns, and attended the same wooden schoolhouse for his, from first grade through the time he graduated. Skipping his junior year in high school, he graduated in 1926 in a small senior class of 14 students after having been voted most popular boy. I should add that Sweetland's developed a considerable social consciousness, which is what part of this talk will be about this afternoon, through his parents and through 2 elderly African American women who he worked, mowed their lawn, and cared for their yard, and they loaned him copies regularly of the Chicago Defender, which was a widespread, widely read black weekly newspaper. He was then, through his long life, a perpetually inquisitive person. People liked him, and as my friend Bill Lang, retired historian from Portland State University, says, he liked people. From conservative Constantine, he was off to an equally conservative Lutheran institution, Wittenberg College, in Springfield, Ohio, where he majored in history and journalism, graduating in 1930. He then enrolled in Cornell University's law school, where he did less the study of law than becoming engaged in anti-war activities and peace-related issues. Sweetland traveled often to New York City, where he met and became friends with the noted, renowned socialist Norman Thomas. And he also joined the organization that Thomas was affiliated with, the League for Industrial Democracy. In the interim, his study of law suffered, and he transferred in the fall of 1931 to Syracuse University, where he was going to make another attempt at the legal profession. The Syracuse interval was even more brief, but it was fortuitous because it was at Syracuse that he met Lily McGrath, who would be his wife by 1933, and her twin sister, Vi. He recalled later, while he was at Syracuse during the first semester, that he was running fast as a left-wing socialist at Syracuse. And he was also moving in ever larger geographies of political activism. Through Norman Thomas's recommendation, he became field organizer for the League for Industrial Democracy in late 1931. He withdrew from law school before grades were in fall semester. That experience, being the field organizer for the League, took him on cross-country travels from 1932 to 1935. And this photograph shows him hitchhiking in some godforsaken place in Colorado. And he hitchhiked, he lived in college dormitories and so forth, and the League was able, therefore, to reduce his weekly compensation because he was so economical. But his travels also took him to travels to Knoxville, Tennessee, and Greensboro, North Carolina. And those were his first visits to the Deep South, and they were eye-opening, revealing to young Monroe the ugly underbelly of American society. And it burnished in his mind, I believe, the race and class question as never before. He passed through blighted rural communities. The Great Depression is growing more severe. Urban shanty towns, homeless men riding the rails to some promised land. Now, what's interesting to me, and this struck me early on in my research, were the colleagues that he associated with through the League for Industrial Democracy. Some of these names will not mean much to some of you, but others will. Mary Fox and Mary Hillier, who were noted left radicals in their time. Joseph Lash, who was the author of Eleanor and Franklin, a longtime friend of Monroe Sweetland's. Walter White, who headed the NAACP for a period. Roger Baldwin, the founder and longtime secretary of the American Civil Liberties Union. And George Edwards, who was a fellow organizer like Monroe, who later went on to different paths, law school and so forth, and became a member of the, I don't know which circuit court, but he was a circuit court judge and even considered for advancement to the Supreme Court. And then, of course, there was Norman Thomas, whom I think anyone who's read much about Sweetland recognizes as his ideological mentor. These were all people, I would add, who devoted their lives to fighting racial and class inequities. They were a stunning combination of activists and intellectual cohort. And they influenced Sweetland, certainly coming at a very seminal point in his life, and probably had something to do with his lifelong commitment to economic justice and support for civil rights for all Americans. Sweetland's marriage to Lily McGrath, and this is a photograph of the very young Monroe and Lily in 1933. This is before they moved to Oregon 2 years later. And that was a union of affection and shared values that lasted until 1985 when Lily died. Although he represented the far left among student activists, Sweetland opposed from the outset what he viewed as the overweening influence of communists in the National Student League in 1934 and 1935. And what happened is the National Student League and the students in the League for Industrial Democracy were discussing a merger between the two organizations, the student organizations. And they subsequently did emerge because Sweetland was unhappy with that merger. He resigned in late 1935, and he and Lily moved to Salem, Oregon, where he enrolled in Willamette University's law school. His third and final ill-fated effort to complete law school. His youngest daughter, Rebecca, told me that she had one up on her father because she did finish law school. This was a couple of years ago in a discussion. More activist politics followed, and I would say they arrived in Salem in January. By March, Monroe was fully engaged in activist politics. And all of this led, I'm going through this very quickly, to the founding, and Monroe was the organizer, that's in descriptive literature, of the Oregon Commonwealth Federation in early 1937. This organization was comprised of socialists, communists, organized labor, Grangers, and so forth. Commonwealth sought broad reform programs, everything from civil rights for African Americans and other minorities, fair housing legislation, and socialized insurance for all American citizens. At least that would be in Oregon. With most of those efforts having limited success, I would say, in the state legislature, although civil rights ordinances did follow with some limited effect on public accommodations. Surviving on starvation wages, and there's a whole other side of the story when Monroe was the executive secretary of the Commonwealth Federation, borrowing money from people, from Gus Solomon, the Gus Solomon Courthouse in in Portland. Gus Solomon was one of his associates with the League for Industrial Democracy, a lawyer, and he would take Monroe to lunch because he looked hungry. Finally, in 1941, when the United States was advancing its arms supplies to England and so forth, and that summer he left Portland and he moved to Washington, D.C., and he took a job with the Office of Production Management, which was courtesy of actually an invitation from Sidney Hillman, one of the preeminent CIO leaders. Sweetland stayed with the federal agency until shortly after Pearl Harbor, when he left to organize and direct the new CIO War Relief Committee. This was, again, a position that he garnered through contacts, Sidney Hillman, and through Philip Murray of the CIO to appoint him as the organizer of the War Relief Committee. This was a building from the ground up because there was no War Relief Committee in January of 1942. So what he did was organize the committee, hired some 21 field people, and sent them out to raise money for war relief purposes. The American Federation of Labor also had an organization like this. But what is striking in this effort are the people that Monroe recruited to do the field organizing, the field fundraising and so forth. There's the esprit de corps they had about Monroe was sort of a Pied Piper in leading them in this great effort. And they raised millions and millions of dollars in the roughly year and a half, close to 2 years that Monroe was with the organization. In the late fall of 1943, he left the CIO War Relief Committee and joined the American Red Cross, and he spent 2 years with the Red Cross serving in the Central Pacific. He completed his Red Cross service with the 10th Army and its successful invasion of Okinawa, which began on April Fool's Day, 1945, and concluded in about 2.5 months. And what comes out of this most striking is a gripping account that Monroe wrote, an 11-page manuscript about his essay on his work with the interviewing newly released American prisoners from Japanese prisoner of war camps. And I edited that and published it in the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2011. Returning stateside in October, November of 1945, the Sweetlands, and I might add that Lil worked in Washington, D.C. for the War Production Board during the war. And her story is maybe more fascinating than Monroe's story in a way, because she was raising their daughter Barbara, living with her sister Vi, who was raising her son Mike, and so forth and so on. They moved to Oregon early in 1946, and Monroe and Lil began publishing a newspaper in the small town of Molalla. They soon acquired another weekly newspaper in Newport, and they published both papers until they sold the Molalla Enterprise about 1.5 years later. But, as always, it was politics that fired Monroe's imagination, not journalism. In the May 1948 primary election, Sweetland won a narrow victory to become one of Oregon's 2 Democratic National Committee persons. Now, that may not sound like much to you, but it was in an influential position because Oregon's entire congressional delegation, senators and congresspeople, were all Republicans, and the president is a Democrat. So who handles post office appointments, to say the least about patronage? So it was a powerful position. His election as National Committee was fortuitous in another way because it placed him in a position to gain stature with influential Democratic leaders at the national level. Sweetland, who had been a fan of Franklin Roosevelt's Vice President Henry Wallace, was disappointed when Roosevelt dropped Wallace in 1944 in lieu of Harry Truman. Roosevelt's death in 1945 and Truman's ascendancy to the president shocked Sweetland and his liberal friends, who were most of them Wallace supporters. However, strange things happen in the world of politics. In 1946, Harry Truman fired Henry Wallace, who was Secretary of Commerce. When Wallace gave a speech to the Soviet American Friendship Association at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Wallace said in that address that the two nations should respect each other's spheres of influence and look for ways to gain some kind of accommodation rather than moving towards hostility. The dovish Wallace then became editor of the New Republic and began making noises about becoming a third-party candidate for president. To Sweetland and many liberals, Wallace's decision was heresy. The former vice president had become a pariah, a dupe for the Communist Party. And my language is mild here because much stronger language were used by some liberals. Many former Wallace devotees now thought he was a fuzzy-headed liberal, or as President Truman referred to him, as a member of the lunatic fringe. When Wallace announced his candidacy under the Progressive Party banner, that was in November of 1947 for the presidential election in 1948, Democrats were demoralized, believing that Wallace would steal votes from Truman and so forth, and it would be impossible for Truman to win the presidency. The super-liberal, staunchly anti-communist Americans for Democratic Action, I'm going to refer to the ADA here quite a bit for the next few minutes, wanted an open convention in the summer of 1948. Feisty New York Post columnist James Wechsler, who was a very close friend of both Lil and Monroe Sweetland, explained Harry Truman's dilemma. Mr. Truman's place in history may be written in Mike Gonzalez's ageless remark about a rookie baseball player. Good hit, no field. End of quote. Sweetland quickly took to the attack against Wallace in his newspapers and with ADA friends, pointing to shortcomings in Wallace's campaign. And this is the way the scenario went, not just by Sweetland, but others. A vote for Wallace was a vote for conservative Republican Senator Robert Taft, who was expected to win the Republican nomination. This is Monroe and Lil and oldest daughter Barbara in 1948. And I might add that Barbara passed away in early February of this year. A Taft victory, Sweetland went on, would hurt the Marshall Plan, I quote, discredit American prestige everywhere, and hasten the economic collapse of the nation. Wallace was playing into the hands of communists, Sweetland continued. How can any honest progressive still back this bird dog for reaction? The Portland Oregonian, in an editorial, observed that Sweetland, who was once an admirer of Wallace, now can say nothing nice about the third-party candidate. Sweetland's changing narrative, which is what interests me on foreign policy issues, marked a significant departure from his anti-war, non-intervention positions of the 1930s and the Sweetland in 1948. His long-standing opposition to communists in politics weighed heavily in his hostility towards Wallace and the Progressive Party. Because Wallace's foreign policy positions were friendly to the Soviet Union, the Cold War-phobic American media charged that his campaign was riddled with communists. Powerful friends from Sweetland's past held similar views with vicious attacks against Henry Wallace. Walter Reuther complained in an open letter to Wallace that he had lost his soul. Communists perform the most complete valet service. They write your speeches. They do your thinking. They provide you with applause. They initiate your ego. They inflate your ego. Historian Ellen Schrecker writes, The fervid anti-communism of the early Cold War tapped into something dark and nasty in the human soul, a strong element of irrationality. Just before the 1948 convention, Minneapolis Mayor Hubert Humphrey, who was running for the U.S. Senate, led the fight to adopt a strong civil rights plank in the party platform. This is Humphrey giving a great address at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia in 1948 in behalf of the civil rights plank. Working with ADA liberals, including Sweetland, the two actually became good friends, Humphrey and his colleagues were successful in getting the party to adopt President Truman's civil rights report to secure these rights. The rest of the story is well known. Southern delegates walked out of the Democratic Convention and formed the Dixiecrat Party, with South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond running as the Dixiecrat candidate for president. New York Governor Thomas Dewey defeated Taft for the Republican nomination, and the Democrats reluctantly nominated Harry Truman. Before Election Day, a gloomy Monroe Sweetland editorialized in his weekly newspaper, and this has attributes of the Chicago Tribune's famous headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." Remember, Sweetland wrote this, it was in press, and it was published the day after the election. And this is what he reasoned, explaining Truman's defeat on reactionary Southern Democrats and Communist Party support for an embittered Henry Wallace as their front man, end of quote. Truman, of course, won the election with 49% of the vote to 45% for Dewey, and Wallace, as I remember, had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1%, a little more than 1% of the vote. The Henry Wallace phenomenon, through all of this, revealed the ugly underside of American politics and what I call the liberal paradox. President Truman had already signed Executive Order 9835 in March 1947, which was a loyalty program for federal employees. This was strictly a political gesture because government security programs already in place had eliminated communists from federal offices. However, the order legitimized the program of blackballing those accused of being communist sympathizers from all aspects of American life. During the 1948 election campaign, the Washington state legislature held what were known as the Canwell hearings, which investigated 6 tenured members of the University of Washington faculty for their communist leanings. The Canwell committee recommended firing 3 faculty, 2 of them members of the Communist Party, a third person, renowned social psychologist Ralph Gundlach, and a non-communist, was also recommended for dismissal because his political activities were a more effective agent for communism than the respondents who admit Communist Party membership. He favored an anti-lynching bill, a federal bill, which never made it through Congress. He favored integration of Southern state political activity and so forth and so on. In early January 1949, University of Washington President Raymond Allen fired Gundlach and the 2 Communist Party members. Henry Wallace was at the center of the firing of 2 Oregon State College faculty members later the next month, in fact. A month after the Canwell firings in Washington, there are 2 firings at Oregon State University. One of them involved Ralph Spitzer, an associate professor of chemistry, a young protege of renowned scientist Lionel Pauling, and an economist, H.D. LaValle. Both of these faculty were notified on February 8th 1949 that their contracts would not be renewed. President August L. Strand told Spitzer that he seemed to be interested in other matters than teaching. His abilities were not in question. Rather, it was his politics. The real culprit was Spitzer and Lavalle's support for Henry Wallace's Progressive Party candidacy in 1948. Spitzer had written Linus Pauling before the election that a whopping big vote for Wallace would serve notice that our bipartisan foreign policy of preparing to win the next war was not what the American people wanted. End of quote. The Lavalle and Spitzer firings, the UW firings, became a national cause célèbre for academic freedom. Because the Laval-Spitzer case made national headlines, and the fact that Oregon State College was a land-grant institution, the U.S. State Department became involved before the end of February, urging President Strand to quit messing around with side issues and to issue a statement, this is a quote, that shows clearly that the men were dismissed for consistent following of the communist line, end of quote. Over the next several months, Strand responded in spades, vilifying Spitzer and his wife, Teresa, who was an undergraduate student and who headed the Wallace for President campaign on campus. Strand charged Ralph Spitzer with performing, and I quote, constant activity on behalf of the Soviet Union, which he terms trying to understand the Soviet Union, and it becomes a capstone on a whole structure of Soviet propaganda which he and his wife have promoted on campus. And I want to add a note of humor as a side note. When I was going through this is only a small part of the Spitzer file in our archives here. When I was going through, I kept suspecting to find a letter from Monroe Sweetland congratulating Strand on his firing of Ralph Spitzer. You'll see in a moment why this is serious. Former New York Times correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges explains rather brutally the way liberals purged heretics from their ranks. In Death of the Liberal Class, which is a depressing book to read, I might add, honest but depressing, he writes about the attacks on radicals, writers, actors, union leaders, teachers, filmmakers, and Henry Wallace as an unconscionable war on dissent. The purge involved the full collaboration of the Americans for Democratic Society, with liberals attacking liberals with more venom than they were directing against bankers and corporate executives. Hedges cites Henry Wallace as a special subject of a vicious assault by the press and the liberal establishment. He believes, and this is mostly quotations, the complicity of the liberal class was in part a product of insecurity, especially since many reformers and liberals had flirted with communism during the Depression, but it was also the product of a craven careerism and desire for prestige and comfort. Former communist and prominent philosopher Sidney Hook referred to the purge of radicals from college and university campuses as a matter of ethical hygiene. I like that one. Now there's irony in Sweetland's personal story, because despite the accusations of socialism, his accusations of let me start over again. Despite his anti-communism, accusations of socialism, communism, and left-wing agendas are sprinkled everywhere against him through his long career. His activities in the 1930s, with several degrees of exaggeration, had a habit of resurfacing when opponents wanted to give events and organizations' subversive meaning. There's a long litany to this in his 2 successful campaigns for Democratic National Committeeman and in his 2 unsuccessful campaigns for Oregon Secretary of State, the first of which he lost to Mark Hatfield in a razor-thin election in 1956. In his second try for Secretary of State, you're one, are you one ahead? Turn back one. No? That's okay. That must be 22. 20, I mean. Yeah. In his second Secretary of State campaign in 1960, John Birchers in Multnomah County circulated on election eve a malicious flyer, Monroe Sweetland, his real record, which likely cost him the election against a mediocre candidate. The paradox, however, is how stiffening Cold War politics in the late 1940s influenced Sweetland's position on domestic politics. Although he fought for much of his life to keep communists from leadership positions in liberal organizations, both Democratic and Republican opponents repeatedly accused him of being a closet communist. His correspondence and public statements, on the other hand, increasingly reflected the views of a tough anti-communist. That ideological shift, again, is a remarkable transition from his anti-war pacifism of the 1930s. If Sweetland had an ideological home during the Cold War, it was with the Americans for Democratic Action. Several Sweetland friends and acquaintances attended the inaugural meeting. Sweetland was there, the inaugural meeting of ADA in January 1947. Journalist Mark E. Childs, Auto Workers Union Walter Reuther, CIO Secretary James Carey, David Dubinsky of the International Garment Ladies Workers Union, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., Hubert Humphrey, and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Sweetland was a member of the first ADA National Board, along with those people I just mentioned. One of the most telling junctures in Sweetland's evolution from pacifist, non-interventionist to muscular internationalism is an op-ed piece he published in the Oregonian in 1952. And what Sweetland was doing was responding to former President Herbert Hoover's speech a bit earlier titled Our National Politics in Crisis, in which the former president was arguing for a retreat to Western Hemispheric cordoned off protection rather than messing around with in Europe and Asia. Sweetland responded in an op-ed piece in the Oregonian, vehemently disagreeing and calling for clear thinking in this needy, almost panicky hour. Hoover's message, Sweetland said, was a 1950 version of ostrich isolationism and coming at a most, quote, damaging time to America's prestige abroad, end of quote. In a reversal from his argument in the 1930s, Sweetland condemned the splendid isolationism of the 1920s as a policy that wrecked world peace. This is a common argument during the Cold War, that isolationism would lead to war. So the historical lesson here was don't retreat as the United States seemingly did in the 1920s, but keep a robust international presence. And then in a ringing endorsement of American intervention abroad, Sweetland declared, "We must now take the initiative in economic as well as military action, or we will live on a fear-ridden island with inevitable disaster as our only future." End of quote. During the height of the Cold War, especially with the emergence of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1950, most American liberals, I suspect, were staunchly anti-communist, suspicious of pro-Soviet sentiments at home, and supportive of a strong military. Hubert Humphrey fits that profile better than most American politicians of the younger generation. People who favored civil rights, wilderness set-asides, progressive social and economic policies, and federal support for education, which was pretty uniform across the board as far as liberals of this kind were, as far as their thinking went. At the same time, Humphrey and other Minnesota Democrats, liberals, led the move to purge the Minnesota Democrat Farmer Labor Party of communists or communist sympathizers, pro-Wallace people, and folks of this kind. Anybody suspected, in other words, of being a communist sympathizer. Labor leaders Walter Reuther and James Carey joined Hubert Humphrey and other liberals on the left wing of the Democratic Party in the fight against communism. Hubert Humphrey supported the Communist Control Act of 1954, arguing that the American Communist Party presented a clear and present danger to the security of the United States. This is at a point in time when I was a kid. A few of you here might remember. I was a communist for the FBI radio program starring Dana Andrews. And I remember the haunting footsteps that you heard echoing in the background on the radio. It was a Saturday night program, as I recall. Hubert Humphrey's positioning, historian James Patterson argues, suggests that anti-communist fervor was politically irresistible during those years. Sweetland's complicity with anti-communism, I believe, reflected political insecurity, something that Chris Hedges suggested, and a desire to protect himself from his own radical past, although he never admitted as such. In addition to his impassioned defense of American internationalism in the Hoover episode, Sweetland took on other issues that divided liberals, opposing the admission of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations. His disagreement with supporters of China's admission to the UN has the onus of a hardened cold warrior. It would be disastrous to admit Red China now. Appeasement or surrender to the Reds could discredit both the United States and the United Nations, unquote. The espionage trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg figured into Sweetland's anti-communist calculus as well. When the Rosenbergs were found guilty and sentenced to death in March of 1951 for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, their supporters launched a campaign to have their sentences commuted. The death sentence, they argued, was too severe, and they pointed out the case of Klaus Fuchs, who was convicted on more serious espionage charges in England, and yet was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Despite protests to the Eisenhower administration, the Rosenbergs were executed in June of 1953. Although he consistently opposed capital punishment and sponsored a bill to ban the practice when he was in the Oregon legislature, Sweetland had little sympathy for the Rosenbergs or for their compatriots who were asking for commutation of their sentences. Among those he disagreed with was a Reverend Mark Chamberlain of Oregon's Methodist Federation of Social Action. This was a group that was based in Gresham, Oregon, which fought against the McCarthy witch hunts during the 1950s, publicizing what they viewed as violations of civil liberties, including the fight to prevent the Rosenbergs' execution. Sweetland wrote Chamberlain, who was a Methodist acquaintance, person that he knew, that he had no sympathy with these traitors. Although he opposed capital punishment he found it singular that you, in the hundreds of capital punishment, that you, out of the hundreds of capital punishment cases, this particularly unmeritorious one is taken to the bosom of your organization. Such efforts were serving evil rather than constructive purpose. In early 1964, Monroe, Lil, and their second daughter, Rebecca, traveled to Bandung, Indonesia, where Monroe would spend a year at Pajajaran University as a visiting professor of journalism. Indonesia at this point in time is caught kind of as an unaligned nation in the Cold War. President Sukarno, Indonesia's leader, was steering a middle course between Indonesia's powerful communist party, the PKI, and what Sukarno called guided democracy. Monroe praised Sukarno when he first arrived for following a path of non-alignment, similar to that of India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Although he was suspicious of the PKI, he and his family left the country after a year of wonderful experiences. In the fall of 1965, when Monroe was working for the National Education Association, young Army officers made a feeble attempt to overthrow the weak Sukarno regime. Indonesia's General Suharto quickly suppressed the coup, and then, following in the wake of that, pushed Sukarno aside and unleashed policies that resulted in the killing of nearly 1 million people, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million, targeting the PKI and anyone remotely suspicious of supporting them. Now at first, and this is out of Sweetland's correspondence, he accused the news media of gross exaggerations, and then he apologized to a New York Times journalist that he had been wrong. He insisted, however, that the numbers of deaths were greatly overblown. Within 6 months, in letters to friends, he was praising Suharto for opening Indonesia to Western investment and trade. The subtext I read is that Indonesia was saved for the free world. America's military intervention in Vietnam is probably the most interesting part of this Cold War story. And it reveals another dimension of Sweetland's support for what he viewed as Chinese and Soviet threats to the free world, a position that put him at odds with Oregon Senator Wayne Morse and growing numbers of critics. Sweetland's correspondence, op-ed news columns, public statements were remarkably quiet about the Johnson administration's decision to bomb Vietnam in March of 1965 and his commitment of ever-increasing numbers of American troops to Southeast Asia. In Oregon's critical U.S. Senate race in 1966, Democrats strove mightily to convince Sweetland to run for the office, even though he was living in California at the time. He decided ultimately against running in favor of liberal 4th District Congressman Robert Duncan. If Sweetland had stepped into the senatorial contest, Vietnam would have provided sharp contrasts between Monroe and Republican candidate Governor Mark Hatfield, who joined Senator Morse in attacking America's military venture in Southeast Asia. In contrast, Sweetland was supporting the administration's policy. When Duncan declared his candidacy, something I will never forget, telling audiences that the critical issue was whether Americans will die in the buffalo grass of Vietnam or in the ryegrass of Western Oregon. Sweetland praised Duncan as a hard-hitting congressman who would champion the Kennedy and Johnson policies. And then he wrote a personal letter to Robert Duncan, warning Duncan that the press was overemphasizing the Vietnam issue because it was the nature of the media to stress the most controversial, even if it is not the most important of the issues. The Duncan-Hatfield campaign, as some will recall, had national implications, had to do with Democrat and Republican control of the Senate. And there were suggestions, of course, that it was a referendum on the Vietnam incursion. It also posed the irony of Democratic Senator Wayne Morse supporting Republican candidate Mark Hatfield. The November 9th election was a solid, if not overwhelming, victory for Mark Hatfield. And I always get a kick out of the Oregonian. A supporter of Mark Hatfield, the Oregonian insisted that the election, quote, was not a referendum on the war in Vietnam, unquote. Election year 1968, one of the most tragic and volatile in American history, was launched amid the TET Offensive, when the National Liberation Front and North Vietnam forces launched widespread attacks across South Vietnam and American forces. This was on January 30th, 1968. The assaults put the lie to General William Westmoreland's assurances that there was light at the end of the tunnel. When iconic CBS anchor Walter Cronkite returned from Vietnam after the Tet Offensive, he predicted the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. When Senator Eugene McCarthy made an impressive showing against Johnson in the March, New Hampshire primary, the president stunned the nation on March 31st in a Sunday evening address, "I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for the another term as your president." I was returning to Eugene from Portland that evening and was listening to to Johnson make that statement on the radio. It was stunning. What followed was an opening of the floodgates for Democratic candidates. New York Senator Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy. And of course, waiting in the wings was Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Sweetland, who was no longer part of the Oregon delegation to the Democratic National Convention, fully supported Humphrey. Although he backed Robert Kennedy on most issues, he deplored those who leapt to the Kennedy standard on the Vietnam issue alone. End of quote. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Kennedy followed, with Eugene McCarthy virtually disappearing from the campaign as though he were responsible himself for the assassinations. Those developments virtually assured Hubert Humphrey's nomination. The one interlude, of course, was the November election. Before the November election was the Battle of Chicago. Now I want to go back for a moment to reflect on Sweetland's bearings in early 1968, before Johnson's withdrawal, before the tragic death of King and Kennedy. He was speaking to the San Mateo, California Democratic meeting on March 5th. He lived in San Mateo. Sweetland told those, and this is kind of a laying bare of his political soul, to what he called a belligerent audience of mostly McCarthy supporters. So what he does is he begins with a recitation of his own credentials. Because I am a decade or two older than the average among you, I have political experiences in combat back to the Depression years when I was a college supporter of sit-down strikes, racial integration, and campus anti-war demonstrations and strikes, and have an early record of conflict with ROTC and efforts to get the military off campuses. All of my adult life has been in one part or another of the labor movement in journalism and in practical politics. This is an undated photo, but it's at about this period of time when he worked for the National Education Association. Sweetland went on to say that during this election, effective liberals would be supporting the Johnson-Humphrey ticket. This is before Johnson withdrew, remember, to defeat Republican conservatism. Those who claimed there were no differences between the two parties were escapists and romantics, condemned to ineffectiveness. Despite the disruptions of the anti-war movement, he continued, he predicted that Democrats would go to the polls, the standard bearers of the liberal cause, critics who claimed to have all the answers. But there was no point in pursuing further what he called this terrible experience, because Vietnam was not even the major issue before the electorate. End of quote. To focus only on Vietnam was to ignore, he said, more important factors such as education and racial problems. Although international crises were difficult, he said, they come and go. Democrats should focus on domestic policies that will lay the basis for peace among all peoples. Now, with the vantage of hindsight, this is me, Sweetland's assessment of the political landscape seems myopic. An ostrich-like inability to acknowledge the searing impact of Vietnam on American politics, let alone the destruction rained on the Vietnamese people. Monroe was not a fan of Eugene McCarthy. The New Left, this is my best friend, who died in 1990, William Appleman Williams, when he was at the University of Wisconsin, one of the so-called godfathers of the New Left. Sweetland was not a fan of radical movements. In his work for the National Education Association on behalf of the age 18 vote, he expressed disdain for the Students for Democratic Society, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the Black Panther Party. Carrying out one of his missions for the NEA, the Campaign for the Age 18 Vote, he remarked, this is probably to a state legislature, I can't remember, granting young people the vote would lessen the appeal of nihilists and those who believed in direct action. His longtime ideological friend, Natalie Panic, whom I could talk about forever, expressed her contempt for the events at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in a post-convention letter to Monroe. I am terribly hostile towards McCarthy and his alleged children. Now, what is puzzling to me in this is the absence in the massive Sweetland papers at the Oregon Historical Society of anything having to do with the Democratic National Convention in Chicago or the events immediately before, immediately after that. I have files on every convention that he was involved in. And he was there, but there's nothing. And I mentioned this to his oldest daughter, Barber, a couple of years ago, and she expressed surprise at the absence of anything about the 1968 convention. When the Democrats' winning candidate, Hubert Humphrey, got the nomination, left Chicago, he told Roger Mudd of CBS News that the demonstrations were planned, premeditated by certain people that feel all they have to do is riot and they'll get their way. They don't want to work through the peaceful process. End of quote. Humphrey denounced the obscenity, the profanity, the filth that was uttered night after night in front of the hotels. Humphrey's sympathetic biographer, this is a good biography of Humphrey, I might add, Carl Sahlberg, contends that to young people, Humphrey was both ridiculous and infuriating. This is a very friendly biography, except on this issue. And yet, Sahlberg goes on, Humphrey nearly pulled off a stunning upset, losing to Richard Nixon by some 500,000 votes. And it was a very close vote. Hubert Humphrey and Monroe Sweetland had been friends since 1948. Humphrey was 57 years old in 1968. Sweetland was 58 years old. There's something serendipitous about their parallel careers as crusading liberals on economic policy, social justice, and a host of related issues. Humphrey, his biographer Carl Sahlberg observes, had been ahead of public opinion for most of his life and suffered defeat in 1968 because he had fallen behind American attitudes and public opinion. Although Sweetland fell far short of Humphrey's stature in terms of public accomplishment, he was similar in ideological predisposition, liberal to a fault and democratic to a core. While Sweetland did not have an overweening president looking over his shoulder, as Humphrey did in 1968, his views on most issues paralleled Humphrey's. In a riveting oral interview at the Oregon Historical Society in the mid-1980s, Sweetland acknowledged grudgingly to Rick Harmon, he's a great guy, he passed away several years ago, who grilled Sweetland, whom he liked, arguing that Humphrey's nomination alienated young voters because of his close association with the Vietnam War. Harmon, who asked tough questions, asked Sweetland if he and Humphrey symbolized an older style of politics that did not reside with young people. And here's Sweetland's response. "Oh yes, sure we did. Because I was a supporter of Hubert Humphrey, I remember even going to a Democratic meeting and giving a speech," this is San Mateo, "in support of the politics of Lyndon Johnson. But of course, I exempted some of the military adventures and emphasized the great contributions in the field of electoral reform, civil rights, and education. But nobody's perfect," he said. Although decisions that led to Vietnam were bipartisan, Sweetland still found the subject painful. When Harmon remarked that Sweetland remained loyal to the party, even though a Democratic president was escalating the war in Vietnam, Sweetland responded that he would never have considered leaving the party. He expressed displeasure with trends to independence and non-identification that many Americans had pursued with the best of intentions. Monroe Sweetland had traveled a broad ideological spectrum between his radical activism of the 1930s and his accommodationist positions with the Democratic Party after 1948. On issues of war and peace, he downplayed international horrors if conflicts involved Cold War maneuvering between the United States and the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China. He largely discounted the brutality of the Suharto regime in Indonesia, especially when the new government opened trade relations with the United States and its allies. Sweetland was also predisposed to support the Johnson administration's policies in Vietnam, and I think believing to the end that the president would find a way to broker a way out of the conflict. He never understood the intensity of the anti-war movement and the toll that it exacted on the American body politic. His letter to Robert Duncan in March 1966, when Duncan announced his decision to run for the Senate, that Vietnam would not be the most important issue in the campaign. And that speaks loudly to his inability. Hold off on the last, don't go to the last, okay, last image. It's a trick coming up. Anyway, it speaks loudly to his inability, I think, to appreciate the intensity of the growing opposition to the Vietnam quagmire. Thank you.